Hello everyone and welcome to this newest edition of Blitzkrieg. This is Remleiz from 40k Theories.
Hi, this is Fiaura.
And on this episode we're not focusing on one specific race. This is actually our Walker special, where we focus on, well, various walkers. So we're going to start off on the Imperial side of things with the Imperial Knight. Now these things, quite large, not as large as a Warhound Titan, but definitely larger than things like Dreadnoughts. And there's an absolute crap ton of variants on these. But what they all have in common is that they have thick adamantium armor and ion shields. Now, like I said, there is an absolute crap ton of variety of knights. So we'll go through them. I'll just run them off very quickly. You have the Paladin, which has a battle cannon and giant chainsword. The Errant, which has thermal cannons. The Lancer, which is a agile flanker armed with a battle cannon and power lance. Castigator with a bolt cannon. Archeron, which has heavy flamers and chainswords. The Atropos, which is designed to combat Heretic and Xenos war engines. Crusaders, which are made from forged worlds along with Castellans, which are slow and nimble but have increased firepower in the form of bow cannons, las cannons, quake cannons, Gatling cannons, a whole bunch of cannons, and increased armor. You also have the Warden, which is a close combat knight equipped with an Avenger Gatling cannon, Reaper chainsword or Thunderstrike gauntlet, missile launchers, and melter guns. The Gallant, which is also a melee type, armed with a Reaper chainsword and Thunderstrike gauntlet. Yeah, there's quite a lot of them. There's also the Baron, which is also more. It's more of like a squad leader version of it, so it's more of a lesser variant, if that makes sense. And you also have things like the Seneschal, which are ceremonial ones.
Okay, so if I'm understanding this correctly, having read about these things, these are entirely machine, right?
No, generally they don't have one pilot.
Got it. Because the way I kept reading about them, kept talking about the machine spirit and how they were in control of themselves, how they didn't require pilots, but they actually have a pilot?
Well, I know some of the older varieties did at the very least, are the ones that were around during the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy. They did have pilots, and there might be some that actually do have a purely machine spirit, but there'll also be, I assume, ones that, such as ceremonial ones, will have pilots, if nothing else.
So I'm going to talk about their overall design and their armor design first, then talk about their individual weapon systems. For a start, the Imperial Knights, I don't quite understand how they can stand upright. They, a lot of the models are very top heavy, and I can see why. You have very, very little on the bottom. You have this tiny middle that kind of acts as a waist, and then you have this huge bulk. I don't quite understand how they can walk on two legs unless they're continuously walking with a very, very wide stance, which would make melee combat very hard, considering that would remove a significant amount of their agility if they can't actually bounce back and forth and kind of dodge, as it were, on their 2 feet. So,
yeah, it kind of defeats the point, doesn't it?
A lot of the people who had these models had several quarters and other forms of extra weight glued to the bottom of the bases so they wouldn't fall over when they were being moved around on the table.
I must say a lot about the design of this thing if the model is too top heavy to balance itself. When it's actually sitting on a base, how is it going to, in real life terms, balance on its own 2 feet?
I have to ask that too. I don't think that this could be an actual walker one day that you would ever see on a battlefield. It's too heavy on top. The next thing about this is maintenance is going to be a pain. The engines are on the almost everything about it is located underneath the armor plates, which is good. It's good for protection. But when you're talking about a walker, you need some way of accessing joints and other mechanisms, and the engine as well as the internal systems. And to access that, from what I can tell from having picked these up and almost been tempted to take them completely apart, you were talking about literally taking apart half of the mech to get to some of the pieces inside, because there's no way to access it. There's no way to access the engine without taking off the entire top of its armor. All the armor on top has to come off to get to the engine. There's no access panels, there's no ingret panels, there's no ingress at all. That's the next problem. But overall, their armor is very well sloped, it's very well designed, it covers as much of the mech as possible, except for the hip joints, which I would have thought you would want to have a lot of armor, because that's kind of a very pivotal point on the mech. But the entire center section where all the torso and legs come together is actually it has very little armor covering it and is highly exposed. Not to mention, considering the height of these, it's also dangerously in melee range of people who are directly below the unit. A power sword or chain sword being swung overhead could very well sever one of this thing's legs if it hit the right spot.
Which obviously is an extremely bad thing for a walker to suffer from.
Yeah, if its legs were severed, considering it has no hand actuators, it would literally just be crippled on the battlefield. Now, its weaponry variance is very impressive. The sheer number of variants of this thing, I have seen everything from mech-sized cannons and assault cannons to mech-sized lightning claws and plasma weapons, lances, huge missile launchers, all sorts of stuff. That's impressive. As a matter of fact, that puts... This is one of the few mech units the few mech walker-style units we've had ever in this show, in which I can say this actually rivals a BattleTech-esque level of customization. You want a weapon, you can probably mount it. And this also means that they can be built for specialization, and based upon the way that the joints seem to look and function, and how many different articulation points are in the arms, as well as different points that look like you could take the arm off. The mechs are not permanently equipped with whatever... The Imperial Walker is not permanently equipped with whatever weapon it was built with. It's equipped with whatever weapon is suited for the job. You can change it out. I would estimate in an hour you could change its weapon loadout. And that is fairly impressive, but also comes with the disadvantage of every single one of its weapons have limited ammunition capacities. There's nowhere on these things I see to reload a clip. There's nowhere on these things I see to change that they carry extra ammunition. Once the current clip inside its weapon is depleted, it's out. And in Warhammer 40k, where battles can involve hundreds of thousands of troops, these things would probably consistently be running out of ammunition. Unless you've got a crew of people right behind it ready to reload it every time it needs it.
And from what you said as well, it's probably going to be constantly falling over as well.
Any heavy impact to the upper superstructure, even if the armor resisted it, would probably knock it over. In melee combat, it's going to have to plant its feet, like just flat out, in order to not fall over while it swings the giant chain swords, or I think in one case I saw somebody having mounted a giant power sword on it. But in order to swing that, it's going to have to plant down, and once it plants down, it's not going anywhere, which means it's going to have to withstand all the hits that it takes while in melee combat. This is not a melee fighter, in my opinion. It's more of a melee brute. It just takes the hits, and it plays Rock'em Sock'em Robots effectively with whatever it's trying to melee.
Basically the equivalent of a tank class in any role-playing game, for example.
Very good example. I guess that's why they call it an Imperial Knight.
Quite possibly.
But the one variant that I found that I have the least issues with was actually the Warden variant, because it literally comes with the ability to go, I'm just going to equip whatever I want, and then some. The one I actually saw had a power claw, a giant-sized assault Gatling cannon, and a huge missile launcher on top, in addition to a side-mounted melt-a-gun. Which I was just like, that's kind of impressive.
You also be proud.
I could also imagine the orcs looting one of these things and being absolutely terrified of what they could do with it, such as the fact of not making it top-heavy anymore, and then making it top-heavy by adding more guns.
No, and the orcs will probably just replace the legs with tank treads or something.
I also kind of expected that, based upon the design at one point, these might have had a third leg. Like a tripod leg design instead of a bipod, but that was just kind of a speculation on my end based upon how the lower chassis was designed and put together.
Okay, so moving on, we're going to move on to the Space Marine Dreadnought. These things are essentially large walking tanks, equipped with both powerful guns and close combat weaponry. Now, the pilot is actually a wounded Space Marine who's actually directly implanted into the Dreadnought via a Dreadnought sarcophagus, which, with the form of a Mind Impulse unit, basically means any actions that the mind receives, the Dreadnought itself will do. So he's not so much piloting, he's basically become the Dreadnought, which also helps with things such as being able to walk, balance himself, making Dreadnoughts, for their size and bulk, surprisingly agile and quick. Now, these things, again, come in a variety of forms. You have things such as the Ironclad Dreadnought, you have Contemptor-class Dreadnoughts, but we're just going to focus on a basic Dreadnought, if you can call it basic, which can be armed with either one or two Dreadnought close combat weapons, which are usually power claws or power fists with an underslung Stormbolt or heavy flamer, twin-linked auto cannons, las cannons, heavy bolters, multi-melters, plasma cannons, assault cannons, missile launchers. These things can pack a lot of firepower, and they're weighing around 12 tons, which with the reflex of a Space Marine inside as well, which means these things actually is surprisingly dangerous on the field of battle, especially with a top speed on the road of 10 kilometers an hour, which for a big fat guy in a metal suit is surprisingly fast.
So, these things do not suffer from their top heaviness very much. And it's because of the much wider ratio of base that it's standing on versus how tall and top heavy it is. It turns out almost half of the weight is in the legs themselves instead of in the. It came out to something like 5.5 tons based upon the proportion ratios of the top of the vehicle versus the bottom is actually in the legs, whereas the other 6.5 tons is in the upper half, which means that they don't fall over as easily as Imperial Knights do in terms of the model, or in my opinion in terms of their and real, what they would be considered if they were real. They also have much better design of the feet than the Imperial Knight in my opinion, because they actually have 4 prongs as opposed to 3, planting them down. It does mean they're a little slower to move, hence the top speed of only 10 kilometers an hour, but to me that's a minor sacrifice for something that's going to be stupidly heavily armored, which this thing is stupidly heavily armored. The average one of these came out to almost 155 millimeters of armor, which, if you remember from previous episodes, is thicker than the Predator or the Lehman Russ. In addition to this, the fact that the person inside is encased in it means that, to me, this is utter hell. Because you have one sole thing you can do now and one sole purpose, and that is just go out and kill things.
It's funny you should actually bring that up, because while loyalist Space Marines would view being encased in the Dreadnought as being a great honour so they can serve for eternity, Chaos Space Marines view it as the ultimate punishment and actually do go insane from being trapped inside a Dreadnought. They actually devolve essentially into mindless beasts over time. because of being driven into insanity by being locked inside essentially a small box for eternity.
And I mean, I don't mean to criticize or make fun, but do they have like Dreadnought-sized keyboards, or like Dreadnought anything that he can interact with without destroying it? Is there something to keep him like able to still interface with the rest of the world, or is he just?
It's possible. I'm not actually too sure, but I know like the Space Wolf Dreadnought, Bjorn the Fell-Handed, the oldest living warrior in the Imperium. He's basically woken up every 1,000. Well, the law is quite contradictory because he's woken up every 1,000 years, but again at the same time he's woken up every century. I don't know how that works, but he's woken up to basically provide the great feast of the Space Wolves, and he's basically there to tell stories. He's like Grandpa Bjorn's going to tell stories, presumably while telling kids to get off his lawn.
Although, if a Dreadnought told me to get off his lawn, I would be off his lawn very quickly.
Especially if he's on an assault cannon.
As far as their armament goes, I kind of have a small problem with mounting a flamer or bolter underneath its power claw. That seems like a waste, because the only time I've ever seen that used, and I've played a lot of Dawn of War, is when the Dreadnought picks you up and is already crushing you anyway, and then decides to burn you with the flamer or pump more bolter shells into you for spite purposes. You're already dead. Why bother? But that's my opinion.
I think it might be possibly, while he's wading into close combat, unleash the flamers, just slightly outside of your range of your grip, so you can soften up before you reach in and crush them.
Point taken. The armor is sloped very well on the front, at least. The upper front. The lower front is pretty flat. The shoulders are pretty flat on both the sides and forward front, but I don't think that you really need to slope it that much when you have more armor than your tanks.
Indeed, you can just, walk into the thick of it, essentially, can't you?
You could just walk into the thick of it, and on top of that, it's not just armored with adamant, it's armored with what's called ceramite, which is supposedly some sort of alloy of concrete and steel.
Which obviously is going to be extremely tough and extremely dense.
You're a walking bunker. The weapon variety is very, very nice. I wish that they would take the time to consider mounting more weapons on the chassis itself, in the sense that you only have the two main weapon systems. That's it.
It's funny you should mention that, because I know on the Contemptor class Dreadnought, which are the ones used during the Horus Heresy, which are generally not seen during modern day 40k, on the actual, for lack of a better, on the hull, they also mounted Cyclone missile launchers basically on top of them.
I have seen that one. It appears as though the Cyclone's been replaced with smoke grenade launchers. What I'm talking about, however, is that there is space for there is the possibility that you could, instead of mounting the weapons on the underside of the power claws, you could actually mount them. There's space and everything for this. You could mount them on the underside of the main hull, just below the red light sensors, and they would be perfectly fine right there. They would not interfere with movement, and you could actually just fire them continuously at that point.
True, but at the same time, since all the Dreadnoughts' limbs and weapons are connected to the central nervous system, there's probably that limitation.
That might be the limiting factor. The human mind can only be able to perceive so much at once, and having, multiple targeting reticules as your as your vision would be slightly overwhelming for a single soldier. All that said, it's actually a pretty solid walker. It's slow, but it is fairly solid and very, 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 very well armored.
I think we can safely say at the end of the day, don't piss off the Space Marine Grandad.
he will come over with Power Claw and Crush.
Get off my damn lawn, you damn kids. So, moving on, next walker is one that hasn't got a pilot of any kind. This is the Castellan robot, the Adeptus Mechanicus, which is literally just a robot. And because of this, they are mere machines. So, while admittedly they will follow any instructions given to the letter, it means that they must be constantly updated and reprogrammed. Now, they are armed very well, generally including 2 sets of arm-mounted power fists or phosphor blasters, and carapace-mounted weaponry that includes yet another phosphor blaster or an incendine combustor. And they also have a Castellan battle hide, which allows resistance to even crack grenades.
So, what you really have here is just a very stout robot. It's slightly taller than a person, based upon looking at the model and going, that's bigger than that's slightly bigger than a bloodletter, but not necessarily huge. The armor is layered, which is why they're resistant to crack grenades, is because there's a lot of space between each layer. So as the crack grenade goes off, the shape charge goes through one layer and then hits open air, which acts as roughly every millimeter of open air that a heat-based projectile or shape charge passes through is effectively 5 millimeters of armor. So as the crack grenade goes off, it's now passing through open air over and over again. I think the total came up to each of the arms and each of the limbs, the arms and legs themselves, have roughly 3-layer plates between them and the actual internal systems, and the hull and the main hull, torso, and head area have 5 layers. So actually getting through all of that with a crack grenade or a crack missile is going to be very difficult. You need a kinetic penetrator, which the entire thing is everywhere been sloped and shaped to be as close to circular as possible. I would compare this to some of the orc designs of Death Dreads that are actually sloped and shaped as circular as possible because they look like a giant potbelly. The gun on top is slightly inhibited with field of view. It can't actually depress off into to the left side because the head is in the way. There's no physical way for it to aim at anything within 10 meters on the left side of the robot because it'll shoot itself in the head. However, that much said, the rest of the robot is actually really solid. I'm just surprised at the extremely limited weapon selection. You had a chance to mount bolters or flamethrowers or melt-a-guns or rocket launchers, and you just chose to mount power fists or phosphorus blasters and an incendine combustor or heavy stubber on top of it. You have a lot more you could do with this, okay? Tech priests, you have a lot more you could do with this. Seriously.
So essentially, great concept, but let down by its rather limited selection of weaponry.
It's great. It's an excellent concept. It's a great replacement for troops on the battlefield, and in case you don't have trained soldiers ready to go, or you need something that's big and bulky and going to have to take a shitload of damage, this is perfect. But yeah, the limited weapon selection just it hurts me a little bit. When I look at the Imperial Knight and the Dreadnought, and then I come to this thing and go, where are all your attachments?
Left on Mars somewhere, probably.
I think the tech priests have forgotten more than they currently know.
Oh, well, definitely. Now, before we move on, I just want to point out, to everyone listening, you may have heard the odd weird sounds going like jingling bells. This is due to a cat that's currently going berserk in my front room. And so I apologise for the random noise. I've had to do recording downstairs today because I've actually injured my back at work, which means I'm very limited to where I can actually move. So if you're hearing weird sounds, that's what it is. I didn't really want to bring much attention to it, but because the cat started to jump right next to me, I thought I'd bring it up now.